Here we are. So welcome everybody. Welcome to our last of the season SAFPAC seminars. Very, very pleased Ian Parker's here with us. As I was saying earlier to Ian, he's all around the world these days and has been physically, and he's writing to so many countries, but at last he's made it to Wimbledon Park. So delighted. Ian, I think you know, is somebody who writes a lot about critical psychology, Marxism, discourse, and psychoanalysis. He's a psychoanalyst, amongst many things. And I suppose we've been talking, Ian, recently about, we would look first of all with Levinas about what might mean to be responsible for the other's responsibility. And we're starting to wonder if Marx could help us look at questions of being responsible for the other's responsibility. And I seem to remember in the 60s, there was all this idea that, well, maybe, you know, that liberated politics might come from liberated personal relationships. And there was a real feeling that Lacan and psychoanalysis might help in this way, and for some reconcile existentialism and Marxism and so on. And yet you're the first Lacanian I've come across who's mentioned Marxism. It seems very much in a very different world on the face of it, but maybe you can help us there. And as for communism, so Ian, your talks on communism, its nature and culture in Lacan and Marx. Over to you, please.
Okay, yes. Thanks, Del, for inviting me to give this talk. So I'm going to talk about communism in Marx and Lacan, but this is a kind of ground clearing exercise. And I'm guessing that if there are Lacanians particularly from Latin America, then some of this won't be very new to them, because there are plenty of Lacanian psychoanalysts in Latin America who are also Marxists. And I've been very lucky to be working with some of them over the years. And so I should say something about the context for this exploration of the intersection between the work of these two theorists who rooted their theory in practice, in political practice and clinical practice. And so something about the immense help that I've had in preparing this paper. There is a massive research project underway at the moment, which is coordinated by Cristina Soto van der Plas, Edgar Miguel Juarez Salazar, Carlos Gomez Camarena, and David Pavon Cuellar. The project is called Marx through Lacan Vocabulary, and the preparation for that involved the coordinators combing through Lacan's work and identifying the points where Lacan referred, either directly or in passing, to different Marxist concepts like alienation, capitalism, consumption, ideology, materialism, value, and of course communism. So different authors were then commissioned to draw on that corpus of work that had been produced and to formulate their own reading of the intersection between Marx and Lacan around the specific contexts. So there are edited books of this work in process, which will be published in Spanish and Portuguese and in English. We'll have 26 concepts, 26 essays by different writers, and the English version will be published by Routledge this year in the Lines of the Symbolic in Psychoanalysis book series. So that preliminary work of constructing a corpus of material from Lacan has made my task much easier. So let's get to communism. The term communism in both Marx's and Lacan's work has at least three meanings. It refers first of all to a future society beyond capitalism, and secondly to the political movement, which is organized around the mobilization of the working class that opposes capitalist society now, takes us to communism. And this double usage is complicated by the third meaning. The third meaning is attached by advocates and detractors of communism to the identity of those who wish for a future communist society, or those who build the communist movement, and those are the communists. So in order to address communism, it's necessary also to say something about conceptions of nature and culture, and that's why that's there in the title of my talk. In both of the authors, nature and culture are intertwined in such a way that you can't resolve the relationship through any kind of dialectical move, saying, you know, that one transcends the other and that we have complete cultural or natural phenomena. So conceptualization of the possible and impossible relationship between the two terms, culture and nature, in Marx and Lacan, is also made more opaque and more difficult by the different valencies of the terms in the different languages that are used to talk about it. So the Marx through Lacan vocabulary includes, in addition to the essays on each of the main concepts, it includes commentaries on the problems that are posed by translation, with little essays focusing on Arabic, Chinese, Japanese, Russian, and Turkish. Well, I'm not going to talk about Arabic, Chinese, Japanese, Russian, and Turkish here. I'm going to focus on what I know of these concepts in the English writings. And the difficulty has been noted by different authors attempting to translate Marxist and Lacanian analysis from one culture to another, and thereby try and determine what nature means in different cultural settings. In both Marx and Lacan, of course, there are some additional contextual and temporal factors that we need to take into account in any discussion of the relationship between these two. The meanings of communism and communists are structured by contemporary 19th and 20th century debates concerning politics on the one hand, and the direction of the treatment on the other hand, and the meanings mutate during the course of each author's work. So I'm going to say a bit about that as well. So I'm going to start by looking at Marx and say a bit about Marx, and then I'm going to move on to Lacan. So first of all, Marx on communism. There's a trajectory in Marx's work from, on the one hand, an earlier phenomenologically oriented and humanist inflected notion of communism, in which the abolition of private property is intimately linked to the end of alienation and to the self-conscious appropriation of nature. That's the early account that you have in Marx. And you have a movement from that, in that trajectory, to the second phase that we can identify, which is a structural historical critique of political economy, which is more cautious about specifying blueprints for a future post-capitalist society, or making predictions about what will happen to alienation. So the emphasis shifts in this move in Marx's writings from what is possible, that's what you have emphasized in the humanist Marx, to what is made almost impossible, what must be overcome. So there is in his early work an overriding concern with the real movement forward of history from a primitive communism in pre-class society to a form of communism which assimilates the experience and the wealth, the civilizational wealth of previous development. So there's then what we find in the later work, a detailed analysis of the forms of production and the corresponding reification of nature that blocks any movement forward, that blocks the realization of communism. And that, in that later Marx, is an analytic account, the kind of account that you find in Capital, for example, that also puts the notion of universal needs in question. Exactly the kind of needs or conceptions of use value that are presupposed in the earlier work. And we see this explored in the writings of some Marxist writers like Ernest Mandel, the economist and Marxist activist, who discusses the way in which use value is configured in Marx's work. Now, the publication history of Marx's texts, including the discovery after his death of some earlier, more humanist works, have exacerbated the already retroactive character of Marxism. That is, we understand Marx's earlier work through the later work. It's retroactive in that sense. So what communism was and what it could be, as well as who is qualified to argue for it, the communists, are profoundly governed by this history, a scholarly and activist history in readings of Marx now as an eco-socialist, for instance, which call for a revision of the caricature, usually an anti-communist caricature, in accounts of Marxism as being necessarily Promethean. And what I mean by that is the exploitation of nature proceeding through capitalism and then being intensified through socialism and communism in order to use nature and master it. So in those accounts, communism in the form of a future society or in the actual practices of societies governed by communist parties is accused of Prometheanism, is accused of valuing industrial development and scientific progress over attempts to live with and against alienated nature. So you have this kind of question of the relationship to nature being explored in later eco-socialist readings of Marx, which go back and think about the relationship between culture and nature. So there's an oscillation among opponents and supporters of communism, both, between holistic ideals of what communism promises when it heals the rift between culture and nature that's opened up by class society and intensified by capitalist exploitation on the one hand, and the technical solutions that could only hope to engineer some kind of pragmatic compromise and maintain and intensify the technological gains that we've made so far under capitalism. So the notion that there will be a historic return on a higher level of social development to once existing primitive communism thus repeats a rather kind of eschatological motif in many radical political reform movements. So this universalized ideal of communism is actually questioned by Marx, and increasingly so in his notes on natural science. And that's where some of the eco-socialist returns to Marx have been burrowing into Marx's writings and finding in Marx's writings something very different from the Promethean caricature, from the idea that technological development will save everything and will be the future. And here we find in Marx's notes on natural science an analysis of different economic forms of what he calls the metabolic relation between culture and nature, which then opens up to a communist conception of how the relationship between nature and culture might be managed in a non-exploitative way. So it's kind of necessary to think this through in order to deal with some of the caricatures of Marxism that are around. Now, whether or not this shift of emphasis in Marx's work from the earlier writings to the later writings represents an epistemological break, which is sometimes the way that it's framed in the writings of some Marxists, of Louis Althusser, for example. Whether or not this shift of emphasis in Marx's work represents an epistemological break, even perhaps a turn from phenomenology in the earlier work to a kind of structuralism in the later work, whether or not there's a shift of emphasis, there are consequences for the notion of communism as a type of society and for communism as the movement towards that society. And these consequences are materialized in the figure of the communist and the political movement that figures adhere to, that supports, that speaks for and drives forward the communist movement. Now, Marx, throughout his work, from the first to the last writings, stressed that interpretation of the world was only of moment if it thereby entailed changing the world. The famous theses on Feuerbach make that very explicit. So Marxist analysis as such was designed to transform what it was applied to, only functioning as analysis insofar as it brought about and reflected upon change. The historically mediated consequences of Marx's own shift of emphasis are thus embedded in, and they reflect, changes in the conduct of the communist movement itself. That's the second notion of communist that I described. So these changes are not only subjective, concerning how the communist articulates their relationship to communism, but also, very importantly, institutional. That is how the communist activist operates as part of the political apparatuses that advocate communism. So in the early days of the movement, in which Marx was an active protagonist, the communists should, Marx said, as an ethical imperative, not operate as a party with interests separate and apart from the proletariat as a whole, as Marx puts it. And this formulation is the dominant ethos of the activist and strategic document, the Communist Manifesto, in 1848. That is, he makes it clear that communism as a future society is already germinal. It must be self-consciously realized to some extent, insofar as it's possible in the movement as such. And that kind of argument, that you need to think about communism not as a point way off in the future, but as something that exists, is produced in our activity now as we try and bring about communism, is something that is echoed in the socialist feminist arguments of the 1960s and 1970s, in the argument that the movement forward should be prefigurative. That is, the way in which we organize ourselves now should prefigure or anticipate in some way the society that we want to create. Now, correlative with the formation of the first international Working Men's Association, as it was called, in 1864, and the internal sectarian and managerial disputes which Marx was heavily implicated in, the adherence to the cause became more structured. It became manifested in the program of an organization, and that called upon professions of identity among those involved. So people would start to call themselves communists, the communists. So communism as a real movement of history tended in this process to be disconnected from communism as a future society, with a symptom, we might say, a symptom of that shift deposited in the identity of the separate individuals who were loyal to the organization. So organizations and individuals came to embody communism, arguing amongst themselves, at least as much as with outsiders, about what the political process and timescale would be that would allow this communism to be instituted, for the now reified program to be implemented. So this kind of institutionalization distorts in some way the link between the future society and the movement forward and the activity of those who are bringing about communism. So there were two materially effective forms of this separation between competing institutionally structured domains of activity after Marx's death that make this even more problematic. Forms of separation through which Marx was read and interpreted, and which then bear on the meanings of the word communism and the word communist. And this means that Marx and the notions of communism that Lacan encounters and that Lacan responds to in the 20th century are very different from the three meanings of communism in the 19th century. So we see the retroactive effects of discoveries and reinterpretations of the key texts mediated by these two forms of separation. So I want to talk a bit about those two forms of separation and describe them. The first of these forms of separation takes place through the emergence of academic institutions, universities that specialize in the reification and transmission of knowledge that's often, in effect, often set against the practical understanding of people and immediate social change. So specification of what communism is, or what it could be, is reduced in these kind of institutions to speculative or positivist programs of research, depending on whether the academic orientation is philosophical or social scientific. So one of the consequences of this separation, in which research into communism becomes taking place in the province of the universities, separated from actual practice, is that the communist is treated as a kind of anomaly, as an enthusiast, if not a fanatic, who is out of place in the academic institution. Well, on the other hand, it's true that the universities do provide a place for communists to carry on some version of their work when they've taken refuge there from the outside world, sometimes a hostile world. So this means that academic conceptions of communism as a future society, and sometimes academic conceptions of the communist, who is accused of some kind of abnormal attachment to a clearly formulated idea of what the future might look like, these conceptions repeat and exacerbate the actual political debates that were occurring in the Second International, that is the Socialist International, that was formed after Marx's death. The Second International, or the Socialist International, is the international that has its remains in the socialist parties around the world, and in Britain in the Labour Party, which for many years was an adherent of the Socialist International. So here you have a politically instrumental gap opening up between the minimal set of reforms that can be hoped for under capitalism and a more grandiose vision of what will eventually be realized in the far distant future. The reforms that will be implemented by the socialist parties, the social democratic parties like the Labour Party, the leaders and members of which sometimes call themselves Marxists, and they'll console themselves then with the gap between those minimal reforms and the more elaborate strategic long game, which perpetually defers the foundation of a communist society. So there's a gap between the minimal program that they'll actually implement now, and the future program, which will will never arrive. You know, there's something that they hope for, but they put off because they can't put it into practice at the moment. So in the process, communism as the real movement virtually disappears from the scene, is made redundant. This is a point that Lenin makes in some of his writings, actually in his critique of the social democratic parties. So you've got a separation taking place, which cuts off communism and turns it into some kind of academic practice or some kind of academicized, speculative future practice in the socialist parties. The second of the forms of separation that I want to talk about come to determine how Marx and the notion of communism will be understood as instituted in the tradition of the Third International, that is the Communist International under Stalin. That is the Third International or Communist International of the communist parties around the world that became very closely tied to supporting the Soviet Union after Stalin took over. Now, communism as the real movement of history is systematically subordinated to and effectively replaced with the party. The party as the bureaucratic apparatus that then demands obedience from the communist, who is charged with speaking for the party and for the supposedly post-capitalist society that's being constructed in the Soviet Union, a caricature of socialism, actually. So Marx's own distinction in 1875 between a first stage in the transformation of society after the overthrow of capitalism that he calls socialism, and the longer term goal in which there could finally be forms of free association that could be called communist, really called communist. That distinction that Marx makes in 1875 is then taken by the communist parties under Stalin as a warrant for the limited horizons of the regime, trying to build what it calls socialism in one country. And it's a kind of excuse for the limitations of that regime. Limitations which mean that not everyone is equal, that there isn't shared property, and not everyone is involved in the democratic decision making. So this socialism in the Soviet Union, in the midst of a hostile capitalist world, is thus set against a future communist society, which would be international, the international society that unites the human race. So that's the second form of separation as a result of the bureaucratization of the communist movement under Stalin in the Third International. So the two forms of separation that I've described intermesh with and reinforce each other, with the effect that communism as a movement, communism as a future society, and the communist as the activist, that is part of the movement and kind of avatar of the future, these three aspects are split apart. And a series of dividing practices in the academic institutions of the capitalist world, in which the communist as the militant is excluded, come to mirror dividing practices in the communist world, the so-called communist world, in which there are either apparatchiks, people who are loyal to the regime, or provocateurs, those who contest the systematically distorted conceptions of communism being circulated there. So those who contest it and attempt to retrieve a notion of communist practice as transitional, as linking our movement now with what will happen in the future, include the revolutionary communist militants of the Fourth International, that is the Trotskyists, among which I count myself. Okay, that sets the background. And I want to turn now, after having talked about Marx and the development of communism under Marxism, to get to Lacan. And of course, we need to anchor what Lacan says in what Freud says about communism. So I'll also say a bit about Freud. So what I've outlined so far is the contradictory context in which Lacan speaks about communism, and the way in which Lacan diagnoses what has become a vision of the future, of a state of being, and as an institution designed to bring it about, and as a form of identity among adherents to the cause, that is, the identity of the communist. The urtext of the Marxist tradition is, of course, written by Marx, sometimes supplemented by contested readings of Engels, while the urtext of the Lacanian tradition is, to a large extent, written or spoken by Lacan, sometimes supplemented by contested readings of Jacques-Alain Miller. But at a deeper, more fundamental level, of course, it's written by the founder of psychoanalysis, to whom Lacan returns, Freud. It's Freud. It's Freud, not Lacan, who is actually closer in his own experience and practice to being contemporary with Marx, and then contemporary with the Social Democratic Second Internationals and the Stalinist Third International. So it's between avid readers of those two writers that we have a long-standing dialogue that then travel through the different emerging traditions of so-called Freudo-Marxism, traditions that Lacan is then responding to when he speaks of communism. When Freud, in 1930, in Civilization and Its Discontents, when Freud refers to communism, it is to declare that he's agnostic about the economic advantages of it, but he argues that, and I quote, "the psychological premises on which the system is based are an untenable illusion." So he's like pointing to the future idea of what communism will be like as problematic. And he also says it's, and I quote again, "an idealistic misconception of human nature." Freud's lengthiest discussion of it 3 years later, in 1933, is of communism functioning as a kind of worldview, during which Freud makes it clear that psychoanalysis should not be considered a worldview. So not only is communism a worldview as problematic, as something different from psychoanalysis, but the fact that it is a worldview is also problematic, because psychoanalysis should not be a worldview. So the subordination of scientific or political programs of research to a worldview would give it, Freud claims, would give it a religious character in which there would be a combination of illusion and a kind of conformist group psychology. So Freud wants to steer psychoanalysis clear of this temptation of a worldview, and he suspects that communism is already prey to that. Now, there is again, in Freud's debate over the causes of war, a debate with Albert Einstein the same year in 1933, reference to the impossibility of overcoming underlying human aggressive impulses, but only of merely channeling. And it's interesting, this debate between Freud and Einstein, because Einstein is sometimes, we sometimes forget this, Einstein was in some ways a Marxist. Einstein referred to Lenin as the conscience of humanity. His political preferences were to the left, clearly to the left, which is why the debate between him and Freud is so interesting. And Freud's sardonic comments about the probability of communism being characterized by persecution comparable with that of the Jews under Nazism, rather than perpetual peace, should also be read in the context of increasing distaste for psychoanalysis as a bourgeois, decadent fake science in the late 1920s and 1930s Soviet Union under Stalin. So you can understand why Freud should be suspicious of communism when the Soviet Union, which declares itself to be communist, is burning Freud's books. By the time Lacan trained as a psychiatrist and then as a psychoanalyst in the 1930s, there was an open breach between supporters of the Soviet Union, of this actually existing socialism in one country, including apologists for the Stalinist show trials on the one hand, and those who were accused of being the Trotskyite fascists by Moscow and by the French Communist Party. And this is important because this is the context in which Lacan is writing. The French Communist Party, the Trotskyite fascists pitting themselves against the French Communist Party, included participants in the Surrealist movement, with which Lacan was at some time associated with and wrote for. So the Communist Party, the French Communist Party, became the dominant intellectual force on the left after the Second World War in France, which was challenged after the Sino-Soviet split by more Maoist-influenced theorists. And these currents, these different political currents, insist upon communism as an ideal, and all the more so as some kind of performative fidelity to the cause, which is represented for them by the state institutions that they follow, either in the Soviet Union or in China, and the relevant loyal party institutions. So you are loyal to the Soviet Union and you're loyal to the French Communist Party if you're in that tradition, and you're loyal to the Chinese Communist Party and to the Maoist group that you're a member of if you're in France as a member of that party. So if there could be communism, it would neither, as far as Lacan is concerned, who is steeped in this history of communism, it would neither, as far as Lacan is concerned, entail the end of conflict, and that possibility is decisively opposed at Lacan's access point to Hegelian phenomenology, nor the kind of mutual recognition that would dissolve human aggression into transparent, intersubjective dialogue. That's completely impossible. That kind of vision of communism is impossible, according to Lacan. The displacement of the human being from being the center of the universe, of being the apex of nature, or being the master of consciousness, also means that the most humanistic hopes of Marx, that the enlightened communist human being will, and I quote from Marx here, will move around himself as his own true son, very, very humanist image of communism, they're quite impossible for Lacan. And those humanist hopes are those in which, for example, his vision of communism is the obverse of religion, but tied to the coordinates of the very worldview that it pits itself against. Marx says, religion is only the illusory sun which revolves around man as long as he does not revolve around himself. So Lacan is pitting himself against this humanist image. Lacan is insisting that not only do Copernicus and Darwin and Freud progressively break open any kind of narcissistic illusion of control, but also completeness, and what Lacan decries as the idea that there is a perfect circular motion at play in which we might discover ourselves. Lacan pits himself against this. This is geocentrism, Lacan argues, and this geocentrism, the idea that there is a center around which things move, means that it is impossible that there will be a future kind of society in which everything will move around the human being as a complete, unified object. This geocentrism, Lacan argues, is at play in popular illusions about a communist future, but it is, Lacan says, reactionary. Lacan says that, points out that Galileo, who argued for a Copernican shift in astronomy, may have been progressive, and he may have been lauded by erstwhile communists like Arthur Koestler for that reason. But Lacan notes that Galileo didn't go far enough when he was faced with this prejudice of perfect circular motion. And it's the idea of perfect circular motion that Lacan wants to get away from. Such circularity is of a piece with the idea that there is a progressive journey towards enlightenment, an illusion that brings together enthusiasts for science as a worldview and enthusiasts for communism. A happy combination, but a combination that Lacan sets himself against, which he calls progressism. That is the idea that there is a movement forward which will eventually be realized in some future perfect society. The illusion of circularity that Lacan sets himself against is complemented by the illusion of intersubjectivity. That is, the illusion of transparent dialogue, which not only characterizes what some hope for under communism, but also invites colleagues to imagine that they might have fruitful dialogues with communists and are then disappointed by those dialogues. And this concern with the problem or the illusion of intersubjectivity is important to Lacan politically, but also clinically, because in Lacanian psychoanalysis, this illusion of intersubjectivity, the idea that the other understands me and that there is a transparent dialogue between the analysand and the analyst, is something that is seen as imaginary. So you can see a concern with the problems of intersubjectivity that Lacan is concerned with here, being rooted in his clinical practice, but then also being used to think about the problem of dialogue in communism, the idea of perfect transparent communication in a future society, and the idea of perfect transparent dialogue with the communists. So this complaint that Lacan makes is the burden of his disagreement with Maurice Merleau-Ponty, for example, who wishes, Lacan says, to have a dialogue with communism, and is then surprised that they don't understand each other. Of course, Lacan is poking fun at his friend Merleau-Ponty for wanting to have a dialogue with the communists and imagining that it could come to anything. So this observation comes at a point in Lacan's work when he's beginning to distance himself from the ideal of intersubjectivity in analysis. The phenomenological Merleau-Ponty thinks that we must understand communism, Lacan says, and is attached to this idea because he, Merleau-Ponty, believes that the foundation of language is that it is universal and that it will bring about perfect communication. And that very much depends, Lacan says, on what notion this universality rests on, whether it will be through recognition, in which everyone recognizes themselves and becomes subjects, or whether there will be something darker at work, something more conflictual at work, which Lacan, of course, names as the death drive. Let's go back to Marx for a moment. Marx, in Capital, summed up the ideological infrastructure of capitalist society and the forms of political economy that he set himself against as, I quote, freedom, equality, property, and Bentham. So Marx's reference here in this phrase, freedom, equality, property, and Bentham, is a reference to the utilitarian philosopher Jeremy Bentham, a philosopher who is emblematic of what Lacan refers to a number of times in Seminar 7 on ethics as the service of goods. That is the idea that if you organize goods or commodities or objects circulating among people in an equal way, then everyone will be happy. Everyone, you can have an equal amount for everybody, equal distribution, the service of goods. And this is a moral framework in which costs and benefits of courses of action and a kind of correlative fair distribution of commodities is supposed to lead to human happiness. And that's counterposed by Lacan to a properly psychoanalytic ethical stance. For Lacan, in that seminar on ethics, he argues that the service of goods is actually to be found in the so-called post-revolutionary societies which exist already, like the Soviet Union, a kind of communist society which claims to be transcending capitalism, but is simply administering society and administering it in a bureaucratic way. That is perpetuating the eternal tradition of power, Lacan says. So his image of communism here is an image which is very much drawn from the bureaucratic practices of the Soviet Union. Worse, while that communist future is only present in a part of the world, he says, that has resolutely turned itself in the direction of the service of goods, it means that we're caught in a trap, the trap of a moral framework and the trap of a worldview, a political economic program and a form of society that is actually administrative rather than open and transparent. So Lacan's comments on the nature of communism as an institution, of the party form and obedience to it, take up Freud's arguments about group psychology, illusion, and worldview. The failure of communist society to displace fundamental relationships, particularly that and it's very interesting the way that Lacan puts it here. He says, particularly that the necessity of marriage was not even touched by the effects of the revolution. The necessity of marriage was not even touched by the effects of the revolution. That is, the family form is still very much present in the Soviet Union, testifies, according to Lacan, to the power of the kind of deeper human proclivities that Freud had already described and rested his analysis on. However, this argument now being made by Lacan is in the context where the Soviet Union is the dominant ideological force and the French Communist Party is functioning as a kind of church. So there are explicit references now in Lacan's work to the Christian ethos of communist organizations. With respect to the state, Lacan argues that the only interest of the communist revolution in Russia is to have restored the function of power. Restored the function of power, though it's not so easy to hold on to, he says. And turning to the party apparatus of the French Communist Party, that is a more immediate competing institution which is set against his own psychoanalytic school, Lacan refers to the communist church and its ecclesiastical authors, who are, he says, excellent workers who are devoted to service as such, a form of service which then necessarily leads to lies. So apparatchiks of this church, loyal members of the Communist Party, particularly paid employees of the Communist Party, then include what Lacan refers to as the communist priest, from whom we receive moral propositions. This institution, communism, pretends to be an alternative to the gaullism it pits itself against after the Second World War, Lacan says, but this is merely a game. It's a game between two forces, avatars of civilization, he says. And here Lacan refers to crusades that perpetuate such games. There's then a significant shift from these critical comments about the Christian moral frame governing the activity of communists, after Lacan comes into conflict with the International Psychoanalytical Association, with different kind of references to Christianity and to Judaism, which I think need to really be taken seriously here and need to be worked through. So in Seminar 10, a year before what Lacan will frame in a deliberate reference to Spinoza's exclusion from his own Jewish community, Lacan refers to his excommunication from the International Psychoanalytic Association. And he says the moral Phariseeism of communists is condemned. And this self-righteousness of what he calls communist Phariseeism is emblematic not only of a particular kind of political stance, that sum of habits, good or bad, wherein a certain established order finds its comfort and security. So you see here very kind of jaundiced attitude to the way that the communist, as the figure who embodies communism, operates. Lacan draws a very clear connection here between the worst of a moralizing psychiatric milieu and this communist Phariseeism. Lacan will rail against the International Psychoanalytical Association, but in Seminar 10, he also puts down the difficulty in making his speech heard to what he says, I quote, is the utterly particular reservations of the communists. That is, the communists are the problem that he identifies as the ones who stop his work from getting wider circulation. And this non-reception, he claims, is why he's been devoting himself to making himself heard within the analytic milieu and giving up hopes to reach a wider audience. In 1970, this carries on in Radiophonie. Lacan complains not only that he's had to face non-reception, what he calls non-reception by communists, but he accounts for that by claiming that they, the communists, set themselves against the bourgeois order as against society, so thereby counterfeiting everything that this order makes honorable: work, family, and country. And you see here, Lacan is very clearly, as a result of his experiences of the French Communist Party and the particular distortions of communism in the hands of the Stalinists, Lacan is pitting himself against communism and pitting himself particularly against communists, and thereby allying with the right in these figures of work, family, and country, as if they are they're good things to be valued. When Lacan turns explicitly to the figure of the communist, the jaundiced picture he paints of communism as such, as a illusory utopian ideal of direct unmediated communication, and of the state and party institutions that betray that ideal as they demand service from their adherents, this is layered with another series of pathologizing motifs. So the Communist Party functions ostensibly as a mere example, but it's a symbolically potent example nonetheless of an institution that someone might join, Lacan says, and he refers to one of his cases here, just to piss off her father. So the conceptual question that's being addressed here, the relationship between the ideal ego and the ego ideal, recurs later in the same seminar, it's Seminar 8, when he says a youngster might contemplate annoying father by brandishing her Communist Party card. Okay, so you have I've tried to set the historical background for the development of the idea of communism and the way it operates as an ideal, the way it operates as a movement, and the way it operates as an identity, and the ways in which these are distorted, each are distorted historically, to provide the background for what Lacan understands by communism and what Lacan reacts against. So we're coming to a close. Let me finish by making some observations on the connections that I've been making so far. The connection and the disjunction between Marx and Lacan at the point of this signifier communism turns around their shared and opposing conceptions of the relationship between culture and nature. The complex contradictory relationship is configured in Marx, first of all, in line with dominant communist and anti-communist representations of his work, by the promised future, utopian healing of the rift between the two that's now characteristic of class society, and then in a deeper reading of his articulation of 19th century debates in the social and natural sciences by way of the notion of metabolism in culture and nature. So the relationship between culture and nature is then reconfigured in Lacan through a classically Freudian specification of the drive as operating on the border of the physiological and the psychical, a reading refracted through the three-register reading of what civilization and its discontents amounts to. That is the three registers of the symbolic, the imaginary, and the real. And the relationship reappears in quasi-anthropological conceptions from Hegelian phenomenology via Kojève, and then structuralism borrowed from Lévi-Strauss, of the way that nature is transformed into culture. The question is whether the continuing and necessary metabolic relationship between human beings and nature opens up the horizon for a vision of communism that doesn't pretend to resolve all the contradictions between the two while ending antagonistic relationships between human beings. So at stake here is the way that nature operates in relation to culture and to different forms of culture. So the kind of semiotic slippage between the three connotations of communism and communist that I started with is what is at stake in the dialogue between Marxists and Lacanians. For Marxists, this slippage usually enables a dialectical movement between the present and the future, often facilitate characterization of what is usually presented as a rival worldview, encouraging pathologization, fixity, which is set against possibilities of change, and a form of universality that transcends 19th century conceptions. These are conceptions that Freud and Marx were both confined within, but in different ways they both tried to escape. I just finish with a quote from Jacqueline Miller. Jacqueline Miller, who comes into these debates as a Maoist activist when he becomes a Lacanian psychoanalyst and then leader of the Lacanian organization worldwide. Jacqueline Miller, the Maoist, claims that the dictum that, and I quote, "there cannot be satisfaction of one person without the satisfaction of all," is Lacan's version of communism, as inspired by Kojève. Well, I'm not sure whether it's possible to argue that, or whether that is some kind of wish fulfillment. I think there's a lot to be worked through if we're going to make a link between Marx and Lacan as a result of this difficult, distorted history that we all encounter. I'll stop there.
Ian, thank you very much indeed. I wonder if I could just ask something before we open up into further questions. Can you say what are the implications of this for practice, for example, your practice as a psychoanalyst?
Well, I think this split between the three dimensions, the future ideal society, the movement that we're building now in order to realize that society, and the identity of the communist that split between those three levels is important to the way that we think about our practice as psychoanalysts, because that split introduces a series of distortions. What Marxism is concerned with is not so much the ideal of a future society, but Marxism is concerned with communism as a kind of practice which might, in the future, lead to a better form of society, but not to any kind of future resolution of all of the conflicts that we face. It's also suspicious that Marxism is also suspicious of the embedding of communism in the identity of the communist, as if the identity of the communist is absolutely crucial for understanding what communism is as a member of the Communist Party, a loyal member of the Communist Party. Now, if we think about psychoanalytic practice is also very skeptical about a future state of being which is ideal, which we could aim for and construct for ourselves as an illusion that we try to strive for, and then become all the time disappointed by that. It's suspicious of that, and it's suspicious of the notion of identity, that when you come out of the analysis, you will either be qualified as someone who can call themselves a psychoanalyst and is really a psychoanalyst, you know, with the identity of a psychoanalyst, or someone who is cured as a result of the analyst and of the analysis and is able to appreciate reality as it actually is. Okay, so those two notions of the ideal and of identity are things that we need to be suspicious of in psychoanalysis as a practice, so that we focus in psychoanalysis as a practice in the process, in the movement forward, in the same way as we focus in our practice as communists, if we're also communists, okay, that we focus in our practice as communists on the process rather than fixing ourselves on a future illusory state or on our identity as the key to change.
So that would be the difference, as you described, with socialism, where there's an aim for the future. You're saying that for psychoanalysts, there's something about the importance of the current process and how we are with each other, as well as the future, rather than just saying, well, we're working for something in the future, which we hope to attain, but probably never will.
Yes, yes.
Well, let's open it up to everybody, please. Just put your mic on and ask your question or make your comment, please.
Silence is, I know this is, in some places was rather dense paper. I'm sorry, I tried to kind of clarify things as I was going through. And I know you're probably kind of like thinking through some of the...
May I ask a question? Hi. I was wondering, what do you see a link between the communist transition, like socialism or something, and dictatorship? I mean, is there a slippery path or slippery road into it? Is it, and likewise as doing it as maybe in psychoanalysis, is that a kind of slippery path that we can fall into, that kind of, if you think an analogy on a dictatorship sort of? I mean, because it seems to me that all these regimes that are you know, they somehow transform easily into dictatorships around the world. I don't know if there's something, just the ideology of the actual practical implications of it.
I think there's two things here. I think there's one which is about the way that any kind of political program is susceptible to be turned into a kind of authoritarianism. It's something that isn't peculiar to Marxism, but it's something that we find in many different kinds of political practice. And not only political practice. If we look at our psychoanalytic institutions, there is a very deep danger in the psychoanalytic institutions of turning into authoritarian institutions. So the kind of slippage that you're talking about is something that we're all susceptible to. Whatever political standpoints we have and whatever theoretical allegiances that we have within psychotherapy or psychoanalysis. There's a very interesting debate going on at the moment in psychoanalysis about whether psychoanalysis is a practice that requires democracy and supports democracy, or whether psychoanalysis is a kind of enclosed practice that can function in many different kinds of regime. And there has been a tendency among many psychoanalysts to believe in a kind of rather misty-eyed liberal way that psychoanalysis is necessarily democratic and open. But actually, if you look at the history of psychoanalysis, it's not the case at all. Psychoanalysis flourished in Argentina under the dictatorship. Psychoanalysis flourished in Hungary under the Horthy regime. Psychoanalysis can exist in many different places and different kinds of regimes. It doesn't necessarily require a democracy, and the internal structure of the psychoanalytic institutions can dovetail neatly into democratic societies and be open and concerned more with dialogue and internal differences, or they can close up around particular kinds of ideals and particular kinds of identity. So I would say this slippage into authoritarianism is not peculiar to communism. That's the first way I would answer this. The second, I would say that the slippage into authoritarianism that we see in the socialist states, in the Soviet Union and in China, in Eastern Europe, in
Korea, North Korea.
In North Korea, okay, are distortions, bureaucratic distortions of the idea of communism. And there are particular reasons why those distortions happen. In the case of the Soviet Union, there was a bitter civil war in which there was invasion by 14 armies from different imperialist countries intent on crushing the revolution. And so that provided the conditions in which a bureaucracy arose under Stalin that was able to seize power and crush the kind of democracy that had existed after the revolution and the beginning of the 1920s. That was extremely bloody process in which there were divisions among Marxists, divisions between Stalin and his supporters on the one hand, who was fixing on these pragmatic bureaucratic tasks of defending the country on the one hand and imposing obedience on members of the Communist Party, and on the other hand Marxists like Trotsky, for example, who said, no, this is absolutely wrong. You can't have communism without democracy. Lenin argued that a communist society needs to be 1,000 times more democratic than a capitalist society. It's an absolute betrayal of the revolution to shut down competing parties and shut down factions inside the Communist Party. It was a bitter, bloody battle that took place. So it wasn't simply a drift or a slippage from communism that brought about the revolution on the one hand, and the later bureaucratic regime. There are lots of things that happened in between, and battles between communists for the soul of communism, you know, for defining what communism should be. I would say that the communists lost. And what you have in those countries are Stalinist dictatorships that, you know, drag the name of communism through the mud.
Yeah.
Blood.
What would be considered the most successful communist state?
I can't see who asked that question.
Oh, sorry, it's me. Hi, Amanda.
Oh, hi, Amanda. Hi. I've written a little book called Socialisms, which came out last year, which goes through 8 different so-called communist states. I traveled to these places and I described them, including China and including North Korea, actually, looking at the particular ways in which they attempted to break from capitalism and the particular ways that bureaucracies were formed in those countries. And I wouldn't say that one can point to successes, but one has to understand the ways in which the failures operated in their own distinct ways as a result of existing in a hostile capitalist world. So the Soviet Union was able to maintain itself as a bureaucratic state for many, many years because it had the political economic resources to defend itself. But other states have had even more difficulty surviving in a hostile environment. I wouldn't point to Cuba as a success as such, but I would say that it's remarkable how far Cuba was able to hold to the more egalitarian and open democratic aspects of communism, given the context in which it found itself through the 1960s and 1970s. And now, with the disappearance of the Soviet Union, without the political economic resources that it had from the Soviet Union in order to defend itself from external attack and from propaganda and interference by the imperialist countries, particularly the United States. So I'm reluctant to point to a success, but I would say that some have failed in a way that is more useful for us to think about the possibilities of communism than others. Is that okay? Does that answer the question? Or
it does, but it also helps understand why you know, you distinguish between the 3 things and the future being so important. Because if there's no place in the present, then there is only the future, isn't there?
Yes, there's the future, but there's also it's a temporal question, but it's also a geographical question. So Marx is very clear when he's writing Capital that capitalism could only have developed as it did in Europe. And he starts to open up towards this idea towards the end of the first book of Capital, that capitalism could only have developed as it did in Europe because of its relationship with the rest of the world. That is, the relationship of colonialism and exploitation, the extraction of raw materials, the use of labor from other parts of the world enabled capitalism in Europe to develop. So capitalism is something that globalizes production and becomes an international phenomenon as part of its very nature. You need international trade for there to be capitalism. And Marx's argument, and this is taken forward in the writings of Lenin and then particularly of Trotsky, the argument is that socialism can only be international. It can't exist enclosed in one country. Lenin is very clear that there cannot be socialism in one country. It has to be on an international level. And the problem that faces the Soviet Union after the revolution in 1917 is that it is not international. There are attempts to bring about a revolution in Germany, which fail, which are crushed, and the Soviet Union finds itself enclosed, confined. And Stalin distorts Marxism and also distorts Lenin's own argument by saying that it is possible to build socialism in one country, and members of the communist parties around the world who are enjoined by Moscow to be loyal to Moscow and loyal to the Soviet Communist Party, they believe in socialism in one country as well. And they argue for socialism in one country. And the socialism in one country is Russia, is the Soviet Union. So everything is subordinated to that regime. That's a further distortion of the idea of communism, that there could be one enclosed state surrounded by a capitalist world that could build communism. It's absolutely impossible. That's why, that's why we communists sing, it is the Internationale that unites the human race. It's only possible on a global scale. And that's why for us, international solidarity is such an intensely important part of our politics, including solidarity with those who are fighting against the bureaucratic regimes, whether that's bureaucratic regimes in North Korea or, for that matter, in Cuba.
Anka, you could Anka ask one now, please, Anka.
Yes, I have two questions. In one question, I would like to go back to Lacan's relationship to Marxism or communism. If I understood you correctly, you said that Lacan actually reacts neither to communism nor to Marxism, but to the distorted version in France that he was a contemporary of. For instance, the quote you gave, that communism not even questioned the necessity of marriage. Of course, that was not true. Everybody knows of Alexandra Kollontai, who was a Russian feminist of the early 1920s. She, was in a political position. She argued against marriage and the building of, other than those bourgeois family relationships, with sexual politics that was progressive and so on. So does the fact that Lacan engages only, with, let's say, the contemporary image of Marxism that he faces in his surrounding, does this hint on a disinterest, or, would it not hint on the fact that he was not very much interested either in Marxism or in communism? And then, and his harsh criticism, then, I asked myself the question, okay, does that mean that Lacanianism and Marxism are incompatible by, I don't know, structural reasons or ideological reasons or, conceptual reasons? And last question that comes to that point is, what about the Ljubljana school? Not only the notorious Žižek, but also somebody like Samo Tomšič, who regularly writes on the relationship of Marxism and Lacanianism, and obviously has I would say, more Marxist image of Lacanianism than Lacan had himself. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Thanks for those questions. Really important questions, really good questions. Take the first one. Why does Lacan engage with communism? I think Lacan engages with the communists and with the French Communist Party for the same reason that he engages with the Catholic Church. That is, he wants an audience and he wants power and he wants recognition. So he sends his écrit to the head of the French Communist Party, who probably didn't know what to make of it at all. And he tries to get an audience with the Pope through his brother, who was a Benedictine priest. I think it's quite manipulative and instrumental relationship with rival forms of worldview and institution that drives Lacan much of the time to engage with these organizations. That's my first answer. And I think that to turn to the second question, I think that there is a contradiction between this instrumental approach of Lacan on the one hand, and the array of psychoanalytic concepts that he develops in his return to Freud on the other. So I've been speaking specifically about communism, but at the same time, Lacan is engaging with concepts of surplus value, which he reconfigures as surplus jouissance, for example, from 1968 onwards, after the student movement erupts, and he sees a different image of communism, of Marxism starting to emerge through his engagement with Jacqueline Miller, who becomes his son-in-law, who is a member of one of the Maoist organizations. And that feeds into Lacanian psychoanalysis a series of different ideas that I think make it possible to argue that there isn't so much contradiction between Marx and Lacan, but some kind of deep homology between the two of them. And it's that homology between the two of them that Tomšič would argue for, and that the coordinators of the Marx through Lacan vocabulary also explicitly argue for, with Tomšič participating in that project. In the same way as there's a deep contradiction between the open, liberating possibilities that Lacanian psychoanalysis offers, that is, it opposes the idea that the analyst should be the one who gives the interpretations. It opposes the idea that the analyst should work in the transference and provoke a transference so that they can then interpret it. It opposes the idea that the end of analysis comes about through some kind of identification between the analysand and the analyst, because the analyst has been perfectly analysed already, and so the analysand has to be the same kind of person. It opposes all of those things, as well as rooting psychoanalysis in language and opening to the possibility that things change historically as language changes, rather than rooting them in wired-in ages and stages and instincts and all of that kind of thing that you find in other kinds of psychoanalysis. You have a contradiction between that openness, that revolutionary, transformative possibility opened up by Lacanian psychoanalysis, and the figure of Lacan himself, who is arrogant, controlling, manipulative, and authoritarian. So, I think we can see this this difficulty of approaching the question of the relationship between Marx and Lacan in not only the institutions that are around Lacan, but also in the kind of institutions that Lacan is part of and is leader of and benefits from, and that feeds his own ego.
I think we did have, maybe we still have, just one last quick question from Daniel.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it is probably a very quick question and also a little stupid, I think. But is it possible that that there is a kind of parallel between communism and therapy? That therapy, if as you said at the beginning of the lecture, Ian, communism renegotiates the relationship between nature and culture, then in a sense that's also something that therapy promises. And in that sense, then perhaps communism is a kind of cure for a social neurosis, and then perhaps therapy can only really be effective if it is some kind of permanent therapy, like a permanent revolution. So yeah, I don't know if the question is, I guess, in what way you, and maybe the same question that Del was asking earlier, how do you practice communism in therapy?
No, it's not a stupid question. Well, maybe it's a stupid question and I'll give a stupid answer. Okay. You can't have communism in one therapy is one way I would put it. Yeah. In the same way that you can't have socialism in one country, you can't have communism in one person. Communism is something that is a movement that is necessarily collective, that involves us in relations with others, constructing those relations in such a way that things are more open and democratic and participatory. I think that's one of the definitions of what communism is for me. But the parallel that you point to between communism in Marx and therapy is a very interesting one. And one of the ways we could think about the parallel is in this relationship between nature and culture. On the one hand, we have the notion of metabolism that Marx discusses in his writings on natural science. That is, the relationship between culture and nature takes different forms in different forms of society, and a future communist society won't be able to escape from that metabolizing process and that metabolizing task. In the same way, perhaps, in therapy, we aren't able to wipe away culture and release our natural drives in order to become completely free of civilization, and neither are we able to destroy our instincts or our drives and completely subject ourselves to culture. We have to learn how to metabolize our nature in order to become part of the culture that we were born into and that we want to navigate around. So there's a task. The way that Patricia Gerovici, in her writings on transgender, and I don't want to kind of set a hair running here, but just to take it as a metaphor, the way that Patricia Gerovici formulates it is very nice, that our task is that we must symbolize our nature. We must symbolize our nature, and that's part of the task of analysis, is to symbolize what our natural being is and what our natural capacities are, and we have to know how to embody culture. We know how to position ourselves as a body in culture. So that symbolization and that embodiment are the two tasks, combined tasks, that we face in an analysis. And maybe on a collective level, those are the two tasks that we face in the movement forward in communism as well. I'm thinking here, finally, of the way that, and this really makes it clear that Zizek is not a communist, okay? Because, you know, Zizek makes it seem as if communism is about wiping away the past and starting anew. No, not at all. Lenin is absolutely clear through the Russian Revolution in 1917, when people are storming the Winter Palace. Lenin is saying, save the works of art. These are precious objects that we've been able to build through our civilization, and our future society needs to build on these, not destroy them and start completely from scratch. So we need to know how to re-symbolize the creative products that we've already been able to produce, and we need to know how to embody in our collective activity the symbolic processes that we're committed to in the form of a more equal and just society.
Ian, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. I mean, I remember sort of seeing that in my ignorance. I saw that, you know, Lacan's seminars were set up by Althusser originally, weren't they? You know, there was this connection with them, and I didn't know what happened to it. And I've never heard any Lacanian in this country mentioned the word Marxist or communist or communism before. So thank you very much. Thank you for helping us with our learning of how to what's it symbolize and embody. Yeah. Thank you very much. Can we just switch on your mics and thank you very much. Thank you. I also this is our last seminar of this series. We will have another series of seminars the next academic year. We start off with our conference, which is on the 2nd of October, on psychotherapy and healthy masculinity. In fact, the subtitle is Exploring Our Values and What Stops Us Thinking About Them. And I think Ian's, certainly helped me, I hope helped others explore our values and what's us stopped really thinking about communism. So thank you for that. The conference, though, in October, on the 2nd of October, will be when we're working psychotherapeutically with increasingly unstable notions of masculinity. So hope to see at least some of you there and for our seminar series next year. Thank you for coming. We'll just leave. We were breaking up into groups whilst some of us go and have some supper, but we'll just leave it open for if anyone wants to chat in the next 20 minutes, feel free to do so. Otherwise, the actual training program, thanks ever so much for the visitors coming today. Great to see you. For those in the training program, we recommence at 8 o'clock. All the best, everyone.